All right, thank you for being here, everybody. My name is Brzezinski, and today I'll present my joint work with Louis, who is over there, on narrative entanglement, which is all about climate policy and climate narratives. And I think it follows very nicely from Ferentz's previous presentation. So our motivation is that climate policy and narratives around climate policy have really changed recently. Of course, Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. But it's not just far right or far left politicians who extreme views on these matters. In fact, climate policy has changed also among the mainstream politicians more recently. So politicians like Emmanuel Macron are much less likely, just anecdotally, to say that climate policy is really great. And this is a far cry from how politicians thought about or talked about climate policy in 2020, so as recently as 5 years ago. What happened between 2020 and 2025, or 2023? Well, we all know what happened, which is that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine came a big energy crisis, which hit European countries a lot, and the price of energy doubled or tripled over the course of just 1 year, and it was one of the biggest topics among politicians. So we try to understand how exactly this change in economic cost filtered through into changing narratives of politicians, so the stories that politicians voice about climate policy, as well as into climate policy itself. So we have a sort of two-pronged contribution. One part is theory, one part is evidence. We start with a new theory of what we call narrative entanglement. And the key idea is quite simple. So we think of climate policy and other policies potentially as having effects on different dimensions. In the case of climate policy, of course, it has environmental effects, but also there will be economic effects, which are now much discussed. Now, in standard models, the causal effects of climate policy are usually taken as given. So voters and politicians just have a sort of given causal effect of whether climate policy can combat climate change and whether it is or is not costly to do so. What happens then is that when there are changing estimates of the economic cost of climate policy, in such models there can be a policy shift, but the causal models relating to whether climate policy can in principle combat climate change wouldn't change. So we would expect shifting stories about whether it is or is not too costly to do climate policy, but not shifting stories about whether climate policy in principle can combat climate change and reduce emissions. Our model unpacks that. In our model, climate policy narratives are endogenously determined. And what I'll show you is that the way we conceptualize the model, politicians will have incentives to offer entangled narratives which hide possible trade-offs of policies across different dimensions. Because of this entanglement, shocks to the economic costs of a policy will also spill over into the narratives on the environmental effects of such policy. And this can accelerate policy shifts away from environmental policy. And we'll show that this is different for left-wing versus right-wing parties, but I'll be precise in what I mean about that in the next few slides. So that's the theory. In terms of the empirics, we do an empirical investigation of climate narratives in the EU over this time period, 2019 to 2024, where, of course, in the middle of that time period is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we analyze this invasion as an exogenous shock, because the invasion, as I'll argue in more depth later, led to an energy crisis which affected the economic costs of climate policy. But that increase in economic costs did not in itself change whether specific policies can or cannot reduce emissions. It did change the cost effectiveness of this, but not whether they can in principle reduce emissions. We'll show that the vast majority of speeches in the EU show this entanglement. And then we use within member of European Parliament variation, before versus after the energy crisis, to show that the same politicians are less likely to use positive narratives about climate policy and more likely to use negative or opposing narratives.
So is Luis in your data set?
Yes, he will be. But we will
There
anonymize
must be
it.
some add-on having a person in the data set.
I should add that Luis was a member of the European Parliament in that time period, so working a lot on this policy. So that's one part of the empirical analysis. The second part, if I get to it, is we then do a very detailed analysis of all the text and the discourse in Parliament. And we show that climate becomes less distinctive of left-wing parties, and many topics related to climate now get taken up by right-wing parties increasingly, especially energy costs, but also green policies in general. Yeah, so I hope to give you a flavor of, yes, there's a question.
So just before you get, I mean, and maybe you'll come to this, but thinking about like the relationship between the economic shock and the efficacy of climate policy. So, you know, I mean, one reason that they might be linked is that the types of climate policies needed are policies that span many countries. And so, you know, if you think that there's an energy shock that then will reduce other countries' commitments, then that reduces your own beliefs about whether, you know, any sort of policy that you implement would actually be effective or meaningful. And so is that something you just want to abstract from, or do you think that this is kind of underlying, at least kind of empirically, some of how people became like defeatist or fatalistic about that?
I think this is an excellent point. So it's basically about that the shock might change beliefs about coordination possibilities, right? So that's the motivation for doing the second part, to check how empirically the discourse actually changed. And I don't really find, this could in principle be the case, but I don't find evidence of that at all. Instead, what happens is that, so politicians generally in our data set, they make big statements about climate policy broadly, saying, is it effective or is it not effective? And very rarely do they speak about, you know, coordination or something like that. More often they speak about energy prices, but also just saying that green policies, that, you know, climate fluctuates up and down, etc. So I don't see a lot of evidence of that, but probably we could do even more of it. Hope maybe I'll get to this at the end of the presentation. So yes.
Just briefly, this take up by the right wing, is that a shift of policy preferences by right-wing politicians, or is that just discourse in terms of, you know, before it was the left that handled the thing, and then now we're complaining about what the left did, and so we're mentioning the problem created by the left, and then the left just doesn't want to talk about it, and so the discourse goes down.
I think this will become clearer when we go into the data, but there will be this. Yeah, both the model and the data will hopefully clarify.
And I guess the other thing is that climate change is a global thing. Mm-hmm. So if whatever the energy crisis in Ukraine makes the US or Asia less keen on climate, Europe may feel more isolated and afford it because they can't on their own sort out climate change. So it becomes less and less, more and more pointless to kind of push for climate in a world where other kind of policies diminish.
Yeah, I think that goes to Noam's point. So in principle, that could be happening. In practice, I don't really see it in the data, but probably we should do more to investigate this hypothesis. And this is one of the reasons why we use the European Parliament rather than individual countries, because the unique feature of the European Parliament is that, firstly, that is the relevant level of analysis for European climate policy, because the European Parliament does a lot of things. And the EU can, in fact, influence climate policy more reasonably than a country like Austria or Germany could. So I think, you know, while these concerns do persist, I think on the European Parliament level, they are somewhat reduced. All right, so I hope to just give you a flavor of the model. I won't have time to go through the model in great detail because I really want to get also to the data and empirics. So probably 10 minutes on the model, hopefully. and then the remaining 20 minutes on how we measure narratives, which is ex ante not clear perhaps, and then also our empirical results. All right, I'll jump back right into the model. So there are two opportunistic parties, L and R, left and right, who face a unit mass of voters, and they offer distinct tax rates, so that's just fixed, with the left party offering higher taxes. What is endogenous is that each party can decide on whether or not to implement climate policy, and this policy affects outcomes in two dimensions, the climate dimension, of course, but also the economic dimension, in our case, that's wages. What are narratives in this model? This will be precise in a second, but it's a set of causal parameters which determines the perceived benefits and costs of the policy across both dimensions jointly. So it's a joint story of the whole impact of climate policy. I'll spend a little bit of time on voter utility because most of the sort of interesting things will be clear from voter utility. So the voter utility under a tax rate TJ and policy XJ consists of these three components: post-tax income, public goods, and environment. So let's go through each of these in turn. Let's start with the post-tax income. So all voters earn the same pre-policy income W, facing a tax rate T. So 1 minus T times W stays with them. But then if the policy is implemented, so only if XJ is equal to 1, they also face this private cost, alpha I. And we assume that alpha I has some distribution, which is symmetric with mean and median alpha bar. And alpha bar, the median voters' cost, will determine quite a lot of things in this model. We assume that each voter knows their private costs of the climate policy, so narratives do not play a role here. The second component I want to talk about is this environmental impact of the climate policy. So if the policy is implemented, then this negative term falls away. So the policy prevents utility loss through emissions, which amount to rho E, where we think of E as the reduction in carbon emissions of the policy, and rho as the social cost of carbon. And rho captures the environmental narrative in our model. How important is it to reduce emissions? Completely equivalently, you could just get rid of E and think of rho as representing both of these things. So either there's disagreement about how much climate policy can reduce emissions, or about how important it is to reduce those emissions. And then finally, there's this public goods element, which is also very simple, even though it might not look so here. So voters value public goods, which are simply financed via this linear income tax. So in the absence of any inefficiencies or spillovers or externalities of X of the climate policy, the total amount of public goods will just be the integral of post-policy incomes times the tax rate. So it'll be just this very simple term here. What we do now is we allow climate policy to generate sort of spillovers to the wider economy or externalities. And narratives mediate the perceived effects of these spillovers. So instead of having this, we model voters as believing that this is the case. So we replace this minus by a plus lambda. And then instead of having this, you get this expression, where lambda captures the economic narrative relating to climate policy. So you'll notice that if lambda is minus 1, then these two are exactly the same. If lambda is less than 1, minus 1, so more negative, then this is like a narrative saying that climate policy, beyond just decreasing everybody's private income, also has even worse outcomes on overall aggregate income, which is why public goods suffer under it. Whereas if lambda is greater than minus 1, this is a narrative of like positive spillovers, for instance, jobs created through green policy.
So the narrative doesn't affect my belief about the impact of the climate policy on my own income.
No, it's just through public goods, which is similar to the narratives. So, that's how we think about it. Yeah.
But it could be that it's how much this it's going to affect me rather than the aggregate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought about this and we thought about this, and I think everything would go through pretty much the same because the lambdas would sort of enter here at this stage with like a little I or something, but yeah, maybe a different way to formulate it. All right, so what are narratives now? Hopefully from this utility function, now that we know what lambda is and rho, it shouldn't be too complicated to see what a narrative is. So narrative will be just a combination of causal parameters, lambda, rho, which are chosen in some bounded feasible sets with like some lower lambda, upper bar lambda, and lower bar rho and upper bar rho. So the way we can think of these sort of this feasible set is that there might be confidence intervals around these causal parameters or conflicting evidence, or maybe these parameters are only partially identified or set identified in the data. All right, so this is what narratives are, and each party will be able to introduce a narrative, so a combination of these causal parameters, and this is what they will compete in. How do voters form beliefs given alternative narratives, or where does the demand for narrative come from? We assume motivated beliefs, so voters will believe in a narrative if it is in their interest to do so. In particular, after observing platforms of policies and the narratives of parties, they choose a narrative that maximizes their utility from a set of narrative policy pairs. So an individual I will choose mu I that maximizes that maximum utility they can get. So this looks like a typo, but it isn't. So it's just the two maxes are here because the mu they choose is the one that maximizes the best utility that they can get. And this will depend on their private costs, right? So people who have very high private costs from climate policy, they will choose a different narrative and equilibrium, or tend to choose a different narrative and equilibrium than people who have a low cost policy. And voting is very simple. We just have probabilistic voting with just an aggregate shock, which means that the probability of winning is just equal to the probability that the median voter votes for a party, which is increasing in the median voter equilibrium utility difference between the left and the right party. So that's the setup. Yes.
But do you think about this narrative as completely separable in the sense that they do not interact with each other?
So all we're saying is that in principle they don't have to be. They don't have to interact with each other.
Because I'm thinking about Stephanie Sancheva's paper on climate perception, and her point is like that people are more supportive around climate policy when the economic dimension is made more favorable. So probably you want the two to interact somehow.
Yeah, and they will interact in equilibrium. You'll see that. So the costs, the alpha costs, the actual economic costs of the climate policy, which is sort of reminiscent of this economic situation. Different levels of this will lead to different narratives. So this will definitely be an equilibrium outcome.
But another aspect of this is that do we need to think about it as a narrative, or can we think about it as a design feature of the climate policy that you come up with? You can design it in different ways, and this way you distribute the cost in different fashion.
That's right.
Across voters. I'm not sure how one could disentangle this. Maybe if you have a good
hopefully you'll see. But you're right that we abstract from this completely. We just have one climate policy, but that narratives around this climate policy.
I don't know which paper you refer to, but there's this Stanchevita paper on how people think about climate policy, which is kind of worth. That's the one. Yeah. And then, how it hits you and how whether you're.
Yeah, I think there will be a flavor of this, but tell me, we can return to it if there isn't. Okay, the timeline is very simple. Parties offer narratives and policies, so this pair mu j x j. Voters observe this and choose a narrative to believe in. Then voting occurs probabilistically and the winning party implements the policy that they announce. So we have a policy commitment here. All right, so I won't go through the formal steps of the proof, but just through three key parts of the intuition. So the first part is that the optimal narratives, the equilibrium narratives, will become entangled. So the narratives that politicians offer will hide any possible trade-offs. So there are only two narratives which make it in equilibrium. Either the simplified supportive narrative, which says there are no economic costs of the policy, or even the policy generates jobs. And by the way, if we don't do the policy, then it's going to be terrible. Another narrative is the simplified opposing narrative, which is, the economy will suffer a lot. This is a very negative number. The economy will suffer a lot from climate policy. And by the way, we won't really do anything to the climate anyway if we implement the policy. So these are the only two narratives that appear in equilibrium. And why is that of policy relevance? It's of policy relevance because this endogeneity in narratives mean that if there is a shock to the system, the median voter will switch in what they wish to believe in. Politicians will switch the narratives they offer, and this can accelerate policy shifts. So I think this picture shows this rather well. So these lines are payoffs from different combinations of strategies of parties, where higher values mean that the left party is better off, and a value of 0 mean that both parties have the same equilibrium probability of winning. And the main point, so here we are comparing our model with endogenous narratives to a baseline model where narratives were exogenous, so beliefs wouldn't change following economic shocks. And we're looking at what the equilibrium is as alpha, so as the cost of the policy to the median voter increases. In the case of exogenous beliefs, so beliefs, these lambda rows don't change, what we see is that as alpha increases, at some point, we switch from an equilibrium where both parties back climate policy to an equilibrium where only the left party offers climate policy. And that's quite intuitive. If climate policy becomes really costly, then even with exogenous narratives at some points with high enough costs, not all parties would support climate policy. So what's the difference to our model? Well, in our model, when the cost of doing a policy increase sufficiently, then the median voter will no longer wish to hear, we have to do climate policy, we have to do it, even though it's costly to you. Instead, the median voter will prefer, with motivated reasoning, to hear, actually, don't worry about climate policy, it's not that important anyway, and it will be terrible for the economy. So what happens is that there is a discontinuous jump because of this endogenous switch in narratives. There is this discontinuous jump in voter utility around in costs, which means that there's a discontinuous jump in the equilibrium, and we switch more quickly to an equilibrium where no party backs climate policy. And this is what we refer to as this narrative accelerator effect. So because of endogeneity of narratives, an increase in costs will lead to policy reversals more quickly.
And in particular, the left switching, is that right?
In this example, but there are other examples that you could draw. Yeah. So in this example, it's the left. That's the first step, this entanglement. The second sort of key intuition with analysis is that there's a complementarity between high taxes and climate policy. Remember that our parties in the model only differ in their tax rates. So any difference in equilibrium must be driven by this difference in tax rates. And in our very simple model implies that climate policy and pro-climate narratives are more effective under high taxes than under low taxes. So that means that for intermediate costs of climate policy, only the left party supports climate policy and offers the supportive narrative, and the right opposes it. And it has nothing to do with ideology, it's just through a tax system. So Here in this figure, the key dimension is again this alpha dimension on the y-axis. And you can see that if alpha is very low, then the only equilibrium is that both parties support climate policy. For low enough costs, it's just good to do so. If alpha is super high, so the cost of doing the policy is super high, then no party will support the policy. But because of this complementarity between tax rates and climate policy, there is an intermediate region of alpha where only the left backs climate policy, whereas the right opposes it. And we think that this is the interesting sort of area of study. So this is where we have policy and narrative divergence across parties. In the third step, and here I'm just giving you the intuition, but in the third step, what we do is, so far we've thought about parties and the optimal narrative of parties, but when we take the model to the data, we won't do it at the party level, but at the individual politician level. So what we do next is we model the decision of whether an individual politician of a party decides to speak on the topic of climate or not. So we do it very simply. We say that individual politicians can speak about climate or remain silent. Remaining silent means that they speak on a different topic, okay? And we assume simply that individual politicians are more likely to speak on the topic of climate if this equilibrium, if in equilibrium they get a higher probability of winning, their party gets a higher probability of winning from doing so. And otherwise they remain silent.
What are the objectives of these politicians? Just opportunistic, or
Yeah, so
if they have citizen candidates who sort of represent a particular group of voters, then
no, it's much simpler even than that. So the parties are opportunistic, and the politicians, knowing what is good for their party and to what extent speaking on climate will lead to a high or low probability of winning, they just decide whether to speak on the topic or not to speak on the topic and to speak on a different topic, which is like sort of their outside option. So it's a very simple, I don't have time to explain this in detail, but very simply what we add is
what would happen if they were thought about themselves as representing a certain group? They had, they had 1 out of 5, and they had one that's in citizen candidate.
But the party would be modeled the same way as here, or the party would also be modeled differently.
Take a stance on that.
Yeah, well, this would be a quite different. I would have to think about this, so I'm not quite sure at the moment how this would change. But then policy commitment wouldn't be possible, for instance. Right? For instance, that would be.
It's both an optimistic and a cynical model.
Okay, we do both at the same time. It's quite difficult to do. But what we do with this is just to add the option of politicians to remain silent on climate, rather than to have to voice narrative in favor or against, because in the data you can also remain silent on climate. So what we predict is that if you start in this region where only the left party supports climate policy and the right doesn't, then if you have higher cost of climate policy, left-wing politicians will remain or become more silent on climate, whereas right-wing politicians will speak about climate more often, and when they speak about climate, they speak more negatively about it, which means that the average heard narrative by the voters becomes more negative towards climate. So in particular, in our model terms, if you think of the proportion of speeches that are positive on climate, negative on climate, or silent on climate, our model would predict that after a shock, the left party decreases the amount of times that it speaks positively about climate and remains more silent on the topic of climate. Whereas the right party increases the amount of times that it speaks negatively on climate. So you have a shift towards more negative climate narratives. All right, so now to the data. So we look at the universe of EU parliamentary speeches over 2019 to 2024, which was a full legislative period, and we gather the speech texts, date and time of speech, and MEP characteristics, so member of European Parliament characteristics, little bit of background. The EU Parliament is the directly elected legislative body, has 705 MEPs in 2019. Britain was still part of the EU, so there were a few more. It has a big role in climate legislation, and there was a lot of climate legislation in that time period. I don't have time to discuss this, but trust me, or rather trust Lewis, who was working on this in Parliament a lot. A lot of climate policy was passed in that time period. These are the parties. We'll focus in particular on the Green Party and the far-right parties. So ECR and ID are the far-right parties. The EPP is the European People's Party, where Ursula von der Leyen is part of. All right, so there are 3 steps in empirical analysis. We generate measures of green policy narratives, of course, and then we test model predictions using only within MEP variation to test how the probability of speaking on the topic of climate changes and how the narratives voiced on climate change before versus after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the important identifying assumption, or what we use, is that within MEP variation, so we look at the same member of the European Parliament. And then I don't think we have time to discuss this, but we also look more broadly at the change in the parliamentary discourse by doing more broad text analysis. All right, so we start with a total of 45,000 speeches. And then what we need to do is first detect speeches on the topic of climate. And this is kind of easy, I won't go into detail. But then conditional on something being on the topic of climate, we also need to extract narratives, which is a much harder task. And I would argue cannot be done really with sentiment analysis, because we want to get causal models. Cannot be done with sentiment analysis, but I would argue it can be done with GPT. So let me show you what we're doing. So this is to extract narratives on the climate dimension, so whether climate policy can impact climate change. So you ask GPT to classify a speech as needed if it implies that climate policy is needed to combat climate change, as not needed if it implies that climate policy is not needed, and as unrelated if the speech does not relate. Focus exclusively on the causal link between climate policy and climate change, and explain in 1 or 2 sentences the reasons for a classification. So we get a classification of a speech as saying that climate policy is needed or it's not needed to combat climate change, and also reasoning behind it. And the reasoning turns out to be really useful ex post. We have a super similar prompt for the economic narrative. So for each speech, we give this prompt, and we get sort of causal statements out of GPT, whether the speech implies a positive, neutral, negative, or unrelated effect just on the economy. In terms of speeches that are on the topic of climate change, climate was a huge topic in that period. So, of course, the Greens talked a lot about climate. 25% of their speeches were on the topic. But even the far right was more than 10% of the speeches on that topic. In terms of the narratives voiced, on the left, you see narratives on the climate dimension, and on the right, on the economic dimension. On the climate dimension, the further right you go, the more likely do politicians say that climate policy is not needed to combat climate change. And by the way, I want to add that this is a very high burden on GPT, right? So we say that classified as not needed only if somebody explicitly says climate policy is not needed. Right? And we see this. And this is the economic dimension, so whether it's positive, neutral, or negative, the economic effect. And already here you can see sort of entanglement, right? So parties would say that climate policy is needed, they also say it's great for the economy. And parties would say it's not needed, they say it's also terrible for the economy. And if you look at the MEP average position, then we also see a lot of entanglement. So the vast majority of MEPs are in one of these 2 corners, so not needed and negative economic effect, or needed and positive economic effect, and very few are in other parts. I'll skip the cross validation. So I believe I have 6 minutes now, or 5 minutes. That's enough for empirical analysis, because our empirical analysis is super simple. I already told you what our identifying strategy is. But yeah, we want to test two predictions of our model. Firstly, about the probability of making a speech on climate, where we predict that left-wing parties move towards silence after the invasion as the costs of climate policy have increased, whereas right-wing parties actually become more vocal against climate policy. And because of entangled narratives, this means that conditional on speaking, the expressed narratives become more negative in both the economic and the climate dimension. So the economic dimension, that is not a story of narrative entanglement. That's just politicians saying costs are higher. So there's nothing non-standard necessarily about it. But what is non-standard is that, as you'll see, politicians are much more likely to say that climate policy is not needed in order to combat change.
Is there anything you can say about like the success of policy as a result
The success
of the efforts to push climate policy?
in what sense?
Did it
To
go
pass.
through? What is the nature of it? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot got passed, but now a lot gets repealed, right? I don't know, I mean, Lewis would know more about that, but if I have in appendix the list of policies which got passed, and there are some huge ton of policies that actually got passed.
What's
interesting? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sure this is not going on in the data, but you could make a case that when energy prices are very high, people are going to conserve energy anyway, so that you don't need so much climate policy because demand will fall due to high prices. And,
That's,
I mean, that
I
would
don't
be
think that-
that's not narrative entanglement. That's just saying that demand will be low. I don't believe that.
yeah.
You know, it would be a very cynical view to argue that, but yeah, it's not a totally crazy view.
I think in principle it could be, but that's not what we see in the discourse.
Okay, I interrupted.
No worries. I mean, it was just a minor point on Michael's comment on, actually, it's something you can probably look within the same policy, whether the speech changes over the shock, right? Which is kind of nice, saying the actual policy is the same, but they just change how they are talking about it.
Yeah, I think we could look at this. This would be interesting. I will say on that point that most of the speeches are really much more grand. It's like, you know, it's like the EU's crazy. Well, the people who say it's bad, they will say they use crazy communists, agenda. Whereas the people in favor say we'll have all these green jobs, it'll be amazing. So it's much. I mean, not everything, of course, but from what I've seen in the data, they're often very broad strokes. And even when people do talk about specific policies, then they complement it with a grand narrative rather than with an extremely policy specific. I'm sure Lewis did it differently and was very evidence-based, but except for Lewis, everybody else is very grand narrative.
So this is the point where I think it matters whether you think about the design of policy or not, because
That's right.
here you can only say it's bad or something, and it's bad for everyone, although albeit in proportion to where they are in the distribution. But if you can also design the policy in a different way, so it has a different impact, then maybe looking for such nuance in how proposals were made, to the extent they were legislative proposals.
It's a good point. I will repeat that again in the discourse. I don't really see this happening, but we should look more into it, whether it happens in a more systematic.
About that dynamics is that the whole Green Deal was planned out by Timmermans and the Commission in 2019. It's 37 pieces of legislation eventually. So it's really all kind of moving along. There is not probably much reconceptualization in 21, 22 of the package, but your point is very well taken. It's an interesting dimension.
But if there were selective repeals, then they may strike more or less against certain groups.
My sense is the repeals are now. But yeah. Okay, let me just have 3 more minutes left at most. So just getting to the very simple results. As I said, it's very simple. First, probability of speaking, this is 1 if the speech is on the topic of climate and 0 otherwise. And the key is that we have this MEP fixed effect. So that's a very stringent specification with MEP fixed effects. And we just look at the pre versus post period conditional on these MEP fixed effects. And what we find is that overall, as expected also by the theory, there's no change in the probability of an MEP speaking or not speaking on climate, but that hides very significant heterogeneity, where the green, which is the middle variable, the green party is much less likely, 3 percentage points, which the average is 20%, 16%, so 3 percentage points is huge. Green party 3 percentage points less likely to speak about climate policy relative to the Green Party. The far right parties 7 percentage points more likely. Of course, you have to add up these two to get the overall effect. So still significant. 3 percentage points more likely the far right to speak on climate policy. And then we do the same basically specification for narratives on the climate dimension and narratives on the economic dimension, and we get exactly the expected results. But instead of showing these two tables, let me just show the overall picture. For each party, so this is not regression based now, this is just the data, but it says exactly the same story. For each party, this just shows in the left bar the distribution of speeches before the invasion, on the right bar the distribution of speeches after the invasion. Blue is climate policy is needed, red is climate policy is not needed, and gray is unrelated. And you see this goes up to 100, but I just saw up to 30 because the vast majority of speeches are obviously not on climate. A lot of them are on climate, but a lot of speeches are not on climate. Anyway, what you see is the Green Party decreases the amount of time it speaks on climate by 4 or 5 percentage points, which is very large. And the far right parties, they increase the probability of speaking on climate by as much. This seems small, but it's a very large effect from the baseline, right? From roughly 10% to 15% of speeches being on the topic of climate. And the whole increase is driven by them speaking more negatively about climate. So when you combine these effects, the overall message being delivered in the parliament has become much more skeptical on whether climate policy can reduce emissions. Yes.
Is there within MP change or it's all driven by between MPs change?
No, this is all, so here I'm not controlling for this, but all of this can be done in a regression analysis where we control for MEP.
Yeah.
So it is within, so the variation is within MEP. Yeah. And I think I can jump to the conclusion slide here. So we also do a lot of analysis on the top words that are used in the discourse across parties, and we see the picture that I painted before, that parties are more likely to talk about energy prices. Right-wing parties talk more about climate, whereas left-wing parties actually talk less about climate. So it becomes, climate enters the vocabulary of right-wing parties, far-right parties after that shock. All right, so to summarize, what do? We do three things. We offer a new theory of narrative entanglement, where politicians have an incentive to hide trade-offs through entangled narratives. And this matters for policy because there are endogenous shifts in narratives which accelerate also policy shifts. We apply this theory to climate change policy in the EU, and we show that the economic shock spilled over into whether politicians say that climate policy can in principle reduce emissions. And then we investigate the change in discourse more broadly in the parliament. And the main finding is that green vocabulary didn't really exist so much in the far right before the crisis, but after the crisis, the far right talks much more about green policy, and of course, in a pejorative way. All right, that's it. Thank you.